It's important to remember that God sees you. The question is always, though, how is it that He sees me? When people think about God looking down upon the earth, and as it says here in Psalm 33, that God looks down from heaven. But how is it that He looks down from heaven? Some people, when they think about God and they ask that question, does He really see me? This lesson this morning is one that really answers the problem of loneliness, of despair, of feeling forsaken, of feeling too small and insignificant for God to notice you. Brethren, it ought to be one that gives us tremendous faith. And the reason being is because even in our moments of darkest despair, God sees us. But as I said, people look at that in a lot of different ways. Sometimes when people think about God, they think of Jehovah as just being completely unconcerned. They look at the earth as being something that God spun like a top, and then He just kind of sat back and He's waiting for it to expire. That is not the God that we serve. That is not the Jehovah of heaven. Some view Jehovah as more of a figurehead. They look at Him as being someone sort of like the tooth fairy. Well, if I do this, then He'll do that. If I put a tooth under my pillow, then I'll wake up in the morning and I'll have $1. And they think of God as that way. Or they think of Him as being one that He sees you when you're sleeping, He knows when you're awake, and then at the end, so be good for goodness sake. They think of Him being that way, that if you want a reward from Him, then there are certain things that you have to do and certain ways in which you have to behave. And they use Him as that figurehead. Sometimes when people look at God, they think of Jehovah as being just a casual onlooker. It's not that He's completely unconcerned, but every now and then He comes by and He checks on His creation to see how you're doing. You know, maybe once a year He's got a point where He's going to come by and He's going to look at Travis's life and say, "Travis, you need anything from me? Okay, I'll see you in a year." You know, that's not the God that we serve either. He's not that casual onlooker. Sometimes people have this idea that God is a cynical examiner, that He's watching you every minute of every day and His eye is never off of you. And the reason being is because He's putting your life under a microscope, and everything that is wrong in your life, He has taken note of it, and He's becoming angrier and angrier and angry with you every single day. Brethren, none of these things are what the Scriptures point out as being Jehovah God. None of these are the God described as the one who sees us, and why it is that He sees us. That's the importance of this particular lesson. God sees. The Lord looks down from heaven. He sees all the sons of men. From the place of His dwelling, He looks on all the inhabitants of the earth. Verse 15 in the New King James says that He fashions their hearts individually. And I believe that that is the point when He talks about seeing all the sons of this world, everybody in this world. But He sees us individually. He knows each and every one of us. And so El Roi is the term that is used in the Scriptures for the God who sees. It's interesting, though, that this term is used only one time in the Scriptures. And that's in what we're going to be looking at in the account of Abram, Sarah, and Hagar, the handservant. And so if you look in Genesis chapter 16, this is the one time where it is used. To give you a little bit of background on where this name comes from, or this incident originates at, you remember way back in Genesis 12 that God had made a promise to Abram that He was going to bless him with all these tremendous blessings. One of them being that he was going to have a child, and this child was going to be the seed through which all the nations of the earth were going to be blessed. That there was going to be a great nation made from Abram. Pretty hard to accomplish when you don't have a child and you're already an old man. And so one of the things that they concoct in the midst of all this is that, well, maybe the way in which God is wanting to accomplish this is for Abram to go into the handmaid, Hagar. Now, Hagar, we're not told where she came from, but most probably where she came from is, you remember back when Abram is passing through the different nations, and he's afraid because his wife is so beautiful that someone's going to kill him and take her away. And so one of the people who they encounter is a Pharaoh. And he sees Sarah and thinks she's beautiful, so he's going to bring her into his own harem. God appears to him and says that that is not the proper thing, that she is married to this man. Send them away. But you remember when they are sent away that there's a lot of different things that are given to Abram when he leaves. One of them may have possibly been Hagar. And so Hagar, who is an Egyptian, may be the one that may be where they encountered her. If you notice in verse 6 of Genesis 16, So Abram said to Sarah, "Indeed, your maid is in your hand. Do to her as you please." And when Sarah dealt harshly with her, she fled from her presence. The reason why she was so harsh with her is because Sarah has had a child now. And because this handmaid also has a child, it becomes a point of contention between the two. And so she wants her sent away. In verse 7, it says this, "Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, Sarah's maid, where have you come from, and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarah. The angel of the Lord said to her, Return to your mistress, and submit yourself under her hand. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, I will multiply your descendants exceedingly, so that they shall not be counted for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, Behold, you are with child, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. He shall be a wild man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him. And he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, You are the God who sees, El Roi. For she said, Have I also here seen him who sees me? And so in verse number 14 it says, Therefore the well was called Ber Lahai Roi. Observe, is between Kadesh and Bered. In other words, it is a place that was established because God saw. God looked upon this maiden that was being treated so unfairly because of this child that she was bearing, that she was sent away. Some of it was because it may have even been from her own dealings with Sarah. But because of someone else's evil plans, Hagar is sent away. She's an insignificant servant in this household. She has been treated as property. And because it is something that has brought discomfort to Sarah, she is sent away. But God still sees her. It's interesting what it is that God asked her at this particular time. Where are you coming from? One of the things that makes life difficult is we spend so much of our time in the past, what others have done to us, what circumstances we're fleeing from. And it's really, really hard to concentrate upon what it is that God may have in store for us because we're so laser focused on what has happened. And so God does not just ask her, where are you coming from, but also, where are you going? The reason that Hagar seemed to not have any plan for the future is because she's just running from something. I am running from my mistress. I have had enough of this life that I've had back there. And so I am getting away from them. If you are always running from your problems, you will never end up anywhere productive. You have to have a destination in mind. Where is it that you're trying to accomplish? Where is it that you're trying to go? But remember that in the middle of all these types of things that are going on, God still sees. If you go to Genesis 21, when the children are actually born, Genesis 21, so the children grew, as it says in verse 8. So the child grew and was weaned, and Abram made a great feast on the same day that Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abram, scoffing. Therefore she said to Abram, Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, namely Isaac. And the matter was very displeasing in Abram's sight because of his son. But God said to Abraham, Do not let it be displeasing in your sight because of the lad or because of the bondwoman. Whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice. For in Isaac your seed shall be called. Yet I will also make a nation of the son of the bondwoman, because he is your seed. So Abram rose early in the morning in verse 14, and he took bread and a skin of water. Notice how small a portion it seems to be that he gives to her. And he put it on her shoulder. He gave it and the boy to Hagar and sent her away. Then she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. Now in verse 15, the water in the skin was used up in the place, and she placed the boy under one of the shrubs. And then she went and sat down across from him at a distance of about a bow shot. For she said to herself, Let me not see the death of the boy. So she sat opposite him, lifted her voice, and wept. And God heard the voice of the lad. Then the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said to her, What ails you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him with your hand, for I will make him a great nation. Then notice this in verse 19. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the lad to drink. One of the things that we understand about God and the way that God deals with us, God had made a promise, and God still kept His eye on the one that He made the promise to. And when she was sent out once again from the place where God had sent her back to, go back and deal with this because you can deal with it. And then she is sent out again. She thinks the lad is going to die, so she puts him under a bush and goes a bow shot away so that she doesn't see the death of this child. But God still sees, and God still remembers the promise that He made. And He opens her eyes. Brethren, the thing that God wants us to do when we think of Him as being El Roi is to open our eyes to some things. Is to open our eyes to, yes, there's a lot in our past. There's a lot of difficulties and trials and things that we have went through. But God does see you in the midst of all that. And though He sees you in your afflictions, it does not just mean that He's the casual onlooker, or He's the one that's just looking at scrutiny, waiting to see how you have messed up in the midst of that, or maybe how you have caused some of these problems yourself. God is seeing what it is that He needs to do to get you out of that situation, if we would just open our eyes and see what God has provided for us. That's the lesson that we learn from El Roi. So Jehovah is the Elohim. He is the one who is the creator. He is the one who is the powerful source of all things. And as we'll see tonight, He is the all-sufficient one who is able to provide. He is the one who creates new circumstances. He's the one that was there with Jacob in his afflictions. You remember in Genesis chapter 31, verses 38 through 42, that Jacob has been treated spitefully by Laban. That he thought he was going to get one wife. Laban tricks him and gives him a different one after 7 years of labor. So he works for him another 7 years for the other sister, the one he intentionally wanted to marry. Then he works for Laban another 6 years. And in the midst of that time, it says in these verses that if one of the flocks that he was tending to died because of natural causes, or something came in and stole it or ripped it apart, Jacob told Laban, I took the loss, not you. And he tells Laban, you have changed my wages 10 times since I have been here. And he didn't mean he got 10 raises. He means he got 10 decreases in pay because of Laban. Over and over again. But at the end of that it says, but God saw. And He saw me in my affliction. Jehovah is the El Roi of Joseph's affliction as well. You remember in Genesis 39 that he has lied, that he has taken and tried to lie with Potiphar's wife. He's thrown into prison, and in prison he rises to prominence. And there are those who say that they will remember him, but they don't. And in all these different circumstances that he goes through, over and over again, what it says in this chapter and many others is, but the Lord saw him, or the Lord was with him. El Roi saw Joseph in his afflictions as well. And because of that, He rose him to prominence. He's the one who saw Israel's afflictions. In Exodus chapter 2, verses 23 through 25, it talks about how it was that God visited His people, and He saw the affliction and the hardship that they were going through by their taskmasters. And in chapter 3, He says that He saw what it was that was going on with His people. And because of that, God made a decision. This is the point, is that when God sees, He cares about what He sees. And God is going to respond to what it is that He sees with His children. And so we have in Hebrews 4, verse 13, that there is no creature hidden from His sight, but all things are naked and open to the eyes of Him to whom we must give an account. That means that God sees every barren mother. Some of the most touching passages we have in Scripture is when a mother who has been without child for a long time makes her prayers and supplications to the God of heaven, and God responds. In Genesis 29 in verse 32, listen to this passage. Genesis 29 and verse 32. So Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben, for she said, the Lord has surely looked on my affliction. Now therefore my husband will love me. It's interesting that in many of these occasions where you would have the barren mother, it was a scar upon her. It was one that caused her to feel that she was less wanted, less needed, less loved, a lesser person than someone else. Kind of like Hagar. But we make our prayers, we make our supplications to our God, and God grants relief in that affliction. Because He is El Roy. He is the God who sees, and He is the God who cares. More than that, in Psalm 139 and verse 16, even before I was formed, or while I was being formed in my mother's womb, you saw me. Psalm 139 and verse 16. Your eyes saw my substance, being yet unformed. And in your book they were all written, the days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them. God sees every child yet to be born, which is a terrifying thought when we think about some of the atrocities of abortion and things that are going on in our world, that God sees it all. God sees the child before it is even formed. God sees and God cares. When we studied about Jehovah, I am who I am. God is not bound by time. That child that was murdered yesterday, God knew about that child in distant past. And God never forgets and always sees that child that was murdered, even as it was being fashioned in the womb. We are never so small. We are never so weak. We are never so insignificant. We are never so forgotten. We are never so discarded. We are never so just made nothing more than a number and a statistic that God does not see us. El Roy is the Elohim, the Creator, the God who sees. That is our Jehovah. And that's what makes Jehovah different and distinct from all the other Elohims there may be that people create. God sees us all individually, and there are none that escape His glare. All the mistreated, all the abused, all the neglected, God sees them all. I want us to look at two Psalms back to back, Psalm 10 and Psalm 11. Psalm 10 and Psalm 11. Why do you stand afar off, O Lord? Why do you hide in times of trouble? The wicked in his pride persecutes the poor. Let them be caught in the plots which they have devised. For the wicked boasts of his heart's desire. He blesses the greedy and renounces the Lord. The wicked in his proud countenance does not see God. God is in none of his thoughts. His ways are always prospering. His judgments are far above, out of his sight. As for all his enemies, he sneers at them. He has said in his heart, I shall not be moved. I shall never be in adversity. His mouth is full of cursing and deceit and oppression. Under his tongue is trouble and iniquity. He sits in the lurking places of the villages. In secret places he murders the innocent. His eyes are secretly fixed on the helpless. He lies in wait secretly as a lion in his den. He lies in wait to catch the poor. He catches the poor when he draws them into his net. So he crouches, he lies low. The helpless may fall at his strength. He has said in his heart, God has forgotten. He hides his face. He will never see. And is that not how sometimes we look at this world? Arise, O Lord, O God. Lift up your hands. Do not forget the humble. Why do the wicked renounce God? He has said in his heart, you will not require an account. But verse 14 says this, but you have seen, for you observe trouble and grief. This is why God sees, to repay it by your hand. The helpless commits himself to you. You are the helper of the fatherless. Break the arm of the wicked and the evil man. Seek out his wickedness until you find none. The Lord is king forever and ever. The nations have perished out of his land. Lord, you have heard the desire of the humble. You will prepare their heart. You will cause your ear to hear, to do justice to the fatherless and the oppressed, that the man of the earth may oppress no more. This is the reason why God sees. God sees so that he might deliver you from the hand of those who are wicked. God sees so that he might make a distinction between those who will put their trust in him and those who will oppress those who put their trust in him. God sees so that he might deliver. Guys, your wife ever said to you, did you notice that the trash can is full? Do you say, yeah, I noticed that, and go sit and watch TV? Why did she ask you that question? Was it not so that you would act? so that you would do something about it? That's what the psalmist is saying. God sees the overflow of filth that is going on in this world. And He sees the ones who are being oppressed by it. But God does not look upon those things and say, wow, that's a tough circumstance. That's a tough situation. I wish someone could do something about that. Jehovah can do something about that. And Jehovah has said, I will do something about that. In Psalm 11, in the Lord I put my trust. How can you say to my soul, flee as a bird to your mountain? For look, the wicked bend their bow. They make ready their arrow on the string, that they may shoot secretly at the upright in heart. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? The Lord is in His holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes behold. His eyelids test the sons of men. The Lord tests the righteous, but the wicked and the one who loves violence His soul hates. Upon the wicked He will rain coals, fire and brimstone, and a burning wind shall be the portion of their cup. This is why, because the Lord is righteous. He loves righteousness. His countenance beholds the upright. God sees it all, but He sees it all so that He might respond to it. And so God does indeed see everyone. In Proverbs 15 and verse 3, it makes it clear that there are none who escape the vision of our God. In Proverbs 15 and verse 3, it says, the eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and on the good. In Psalm 34, in verse 15, it says, the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and His ears are open to their cry. Though it is true that God sees everyone, God is particularly concerned about you. Particularly concerned about you. And He sees everyone at all times. He's not confined by time. He sees everyone in every place. He's not confined by location or region. There's not a place where you can go and hide from God. But God's especially concerned about you. Are you out there in the desert running from something? God sees that. Are you running and you don't know where it is that you're headed? God sees that. And He still asks that same question. Where are you from? But also, where are you going? And God has made you promises. And because of those promises, God wants you to open your eyes that, yes, though you're going through a deserted place, though you're wandering in a desert right now, God has promised you some great things. He sees it because He's already there. He wants you to see it, to open your eyes. And so God does not see as a man sees. You remember when Samuel is told to go to the house of David and his brothers to pick out the next king and anoint the next king over God's people. That one of David's brothers walks by, a strong, strapping man, and God tells Samuel, don't look at his appearance. God doesn't look at appearance. God looks at the heart. God knows what you're going through. He sees the most intimate details about your life, and He wants to help in all of those things and in all those situations. And so when we think and bring this lesson to a close, think about this. Jehovah, El Roi, saw the wickedness of sin. He saw when Eve took of the fruit of that tree and gave it to her husband with her, and they ate of it. El Roi, Jehovah, is the God who sees what that did to this world. And how by Genesis chapter 6, the world had become so corrupt that every thought of the imagination of His heart was only of evil continually. God saw those hearts that only could think of those things that were evil. And in the midst of all that, God saw a world that was so corrupt that He was even sorry that He made mankind. But God also saw Noah. And that Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. This same Jehovah God, El Roi, is the one who saw that a solution was needed. And that, yes, He could destroy the whole world with a flood. But that would have been wrong to do to Noah. And there would be people like Noah that even in the midst of whatever generation that they are living will be able to find favor, find grace in the eyes of the Lord, because the Lord sees and the Lord knows. And so God saw that there was a solution that was needed. And He blessed them. And He brought forth the promises that eventually caused Jehovah to see His own Son hanging on a cross with nails in His hands and His feet, and a crown of thorns on His head, and stripes all over His back from the brutal beating he underwent before he ever had to carry his own cross toward Golgotha. God saw when the people spit at Jesus and sneered at Jesus and cast derisions at Jesus. God saw that that sacrifice was needed, because God was not just back then seeing those who needed it, but brethren, God was seeing me and you today who needed that sacrifice. He is the God who sees. He is El Roi. God is the one who saw His own Son die upon the cross. And just as it was in Luke chapter 15, that as that Father is there and He sees His Son a great way off, it says, that when He saw Him, He had compassion on Him, and He ran out to Him, and He fell upon His neck, and He kissed Him. Because God sees when you're coming home. And that's what God wants. Where are you from? And where are you going? We serve El Roi, the God who sees. When you read through the Scriptures, brethren, take special note of how many times it talks about the Lord looking and the Lord seeing. And notice that it does not just say that He looks and that He sees, but notice how much God cares and what it is that God proposes to do. It would make the God of heaven so happy this morning, and all the angels would also rejoice along with Him, if the Lord were to see someone this morning respond to the gospel. If you need help, if you feel like you've been forsaken by all the world, God is the one who can provide comfort to you. In your affliction, God sees. Let Him help you in any way that He can. As together we stand and sing, won't you please come if we can be of assistance?